President Donald Trump announces he will hold off on striking Iranian energy sites for another 10 days. This highly specific tactical pause was delivered by the White House and detailed in a report from CNN today. The announcement marks a sudden and critical deceleration in the United States military escalation timeline. The message delivered from Washington establishes a rigid countdown for the Iranian leadership to accept defeat. According to CNN, this 10-day window is publicly framed as a final opportunity for diplomatic capitulation. The clear implication is that the systematic destruction of Iran's energy sector will commence when the clock expires. United States officials suggest that the pause demonstrates the administration's willingness to exhaust all peaceful avenues. Tehran claims its defensive posture remains absolute despite the looming threat of total infrastructure annihilation. However, military assessments suggest the Iranian command architecture is utilizing this exact pause to aggressively fortify. The promise to wait exactly 10 days reveals a profound underlying tension within the United States security apparatus. Decisive military action in recent weeks has not yet produced the intended political submission from the Iranian clerics. Therefore, the logic of the ultimatum dictates that the ultimate application of kinetic force is merely delayed. A report from CNN indicates that the administration views this newly established deadline as absolute and immovable. The situation has reached a critical threshold where the countdown itself operates as a psychological weapon. If Tehran refuses to surrender unconditionally, the United States is reportedly preparing unprecedented destruction packages. However, the true strategic logic behind this delay requires a much deeper analytical examination. To understand the full weight of what this 10-day delay actually represents to the global economy, you need this analysis immediately. Subscribe to our reporting network right now. Turn on notifications, and leave your strategic assessment in the comments below. The geopolitical geometry of this conflict has shifted, and the official framing is no longer sufficient. To understand the gravity of this 10-day pause, we must analyze the structural forces operating behind closed doors. The decision to hold fire on Iranian energy sites is not believed to be a gesture of diplomatic mercy. It is an implicit and forced acknowledgement of the catastrophic vulnerability of the global economic system. The United States is attempting to force a political collapse without triggering a worldwide financial meltdown. Strategic analysts refer to this specific operational dynamic as a classic economic escalation trap. When a massive application of military force threatens the attacker's own domestic economy, strategic options rapidly narrow. A report from CNN notes that the White House is explicitly delaying the trajectory of maximum economic disruption. What does striking energy sites actually mean in the context of the globalized commodity market? The United States military possesses the absolute capability to vaporize Karg Island and the South Pars gas fields. It can effortlessly neutralize the logistical networks that keep the Iranian civilian economy functioning tomorrow morning. However, destroying Iran's oil export capacity removes a massive volume of crude from global markets instantaneously. Defense analysts believe this involves the systematic disruption of the entire Persian Gulf maritime energy corridor. It transforms a localized kinetic conflict into a total war of global economic attrition and supply chain paralysis. The Iranian leadership views the absorption of this punishment as a fundamental component of their survival doctrine. They calculate that the United States cannot actually afford to let the 10-day clock expire without immense self-harm. The White House is essentially wielding a weapon of mass economic destruction while hesitating to pull the trigger. The central contradiction of this 10-day ultimatum lies in the complex mechanics of global maritime insurance. If the United States executes these energy strikes, Iran's retaliation matrix becomes highly predictable and devastating. Tehran has consistently signaled that it will physically close the Strait of Hormuz in direct response. Strategic analysts suggest that the 10-day pause is actually a necessary concession to global insurance markets. Hitting Iran's core infrastructure guarantees the retaliatory destruction of vital Gulf energy nodes in neighboring countries. The shipping lanes would immediately transition from a high-risk transit corridor to an uninsurable total exclusion zone. This is the exact nightmare scenario that international underwriters have reportedly been warning the administration about. If the United States military dismantles Iran's domestic capacity, global crude prices will detach from physical reality. The 10-day hold is believed to be the exact amount of time required for Allied commercial tankers to clear the Gulf. It is a logistical buffer designed to prevent the immediate seizure or destruction of billions in maritime assets. However, macroeconomic models indicate that oil approaching $200 a barrel triggers a global recession. It systematically destroys discretionary consumer spending, spikes transportation costs, and induces crippling sustained inflation. The threat to hit Iranian energy sites is simultaneously a direct and profound threat to American domestic stability. This structural economic vulnerability is the primary strategic leverage that Tehran relies upon today. The Iranian strategy does not require defeating the United States military in the skies over the Middle East. It only requires inflicting a level of global economic pain that the American electorate will absolutely reject. By setting a 10-day countdown, the United States has inadvertently highlighted its own economic constraints. The ultimatum also places unprecedented operational and political strain on the United States alliance network. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates sit on the absolute front line of this impending escalation. If Washington strikes Iranian energy sites in 10 days, these partner nations will inevitably absorb the kinetic blowback. Their desalination plants, massive export terminals, and financial centers become immediate and unprotected secondary targets. United States diplomats are reportedly struggling to reassure these partners of America's infallible defensive umbrella. However, recent combat events have clearly demonstrated the severe limitations of advanced missile defense shields. The reality is that no defensive architecture can intercept a saturated, multi-vector drone swarm perfectly every time. By publicly setting a countdown for energy strikes, the administration is forcing its regional allies into a highly exposed position. Gulf sovereign wealth funds are reportedly reassessing risk in ways that could produce massive capital withdrawal. A report from CNN suggests that regional leaders are quietly urging Washington to extend the pause indefinitely. They understand that destroying Tehran's airport does not remove Tehran's capability to destroy Gulf refineries. The asymmetry of vulnerability in the region is a strategic condition that American firepower cannot erase. Iran is telling its neighbors that the protection Washington promised will not save their critical civilian infrastructure. The choice for Gulf states is between hosting American forces or finding a quiet accommodation with Tehran. This internal contradiction threatens to fracture the coalition that the United States relies upon for power projection. The global energy system's structural vulnerability that this 10-day pause exposes is historically profound. It is a severe problem for every economy on Earth that relies on the predictable pricing of fossil fuels. The political narrative of American energy independence is consistently shattered by the reality of globalized commodity markets. A country can produce all the oil it needs domestically and still be devastated by global price spikes. This is because selling domestic oil below the global benchmark is economically irrational for producing corporations. Therefore, the consequences of the clock expiring in 10 days will not be confined to the Middle East. Price disruptions generated by strikes on Iranian energy will arrive directly in household budgets worldwide. Consumers in Toronto, Tokyo, and Chicago will absorb the immense cost of this military escalation immediately. When retail gasoline prices double, the economic calculation for consumer behavior changes permanently and irreversibly. The decision is no longer whether to absorb higher fuel costs, but whether to eliminate them entirely. This conflict is inadvertently accelerating the global transition away from the fossil fuel economic model. The irony is that military actions designed to secure regional dominance are making oil economically toxic. Once that behavioral shift toward electric alternatives occurs at scale, it never reverses when peace returns. The administration's threat to escalate the war carries long-term structural consequences that outlast any presidency. The very oil industry the United States seeks to protect reportedly demanded this 10-day pause to survive. The operational reality of what happens after these 10 days is the most analytically significant detail. Military theorists have documented the mechanics of the escalation trap with sufficient historical evidence. The logic begins with a decision to change a bad strategic situation through a decisive military action. You strike a target, calculate that the strike will alter the adversary's decision-making, and wait for capitulation. When the capitulation does not arrive, the analysis concludes that the initial strike was simply insufficient. The attacking force assumes that a larger, harder strike will finally produce the desired political result. However, the larger strike rarely produces capitulation when the adversary is fighting for absolute regime survival. The adversary adapts its tactics, hardens its resistance, and presents a new set of highly dispersed targets. Each successive strike requires significantly more force than the previous one to produce the same psychological effect. The force commitment escalates, the exit strategy vanishes, and the original objective becomes hopelessly obscured. This is the precise pattern that the United States is currently demonstrating with the 10-day countdown. The threat to hit harder is justified solely by the failure of the previous application of military force. The exit from this cycle requires either achieving the original objective or accepting a humiliating political cost. Neither option is currently visible in the administration's public positioning or its daily diplomatic messaging. The war that was supposed to be a demonstration of rapid American dominance is now ruled by a stopwatch. The geopolitical landscape is currently defined by a profound asymmetry of stakes between Washington and Tehran. For the United States, this 10-day window is a matter of regional policy, deterrence, and strategic influence. For the Iranian leadership, this countdown has rapidly evolved into a matter of absolute, existential regime survival. When survival is at stake, the rational calculations that govern traditional economic deterrence simply evaporate. CNN noted that the White House expects the threat of energy destruction to produce Iranian capitulation. However, historical precedents involving ideologically driven states suggest a vastly different and highly destructive outcome. Regimes facing existential deadlines rarely surrender simply to avoid the destruction of their physical infrastructure. Instead, they utilize the 10-day window to consolidate domestic power and radically escalate their asymmetric responses. Iran is reportedly moving its most critical assets deeper underground and dispersing its mobile missile launchers. This leaves the United States facing a scenario where the clock expires, but the adversary does not yield. The result would force Washington to either execute a globally destructive strike or back down very publicly. Executing the strike isolates the United States globally, paralyzes the world economy, and guarantees widespread regional chaos. Backing down shatters the credibility of American military ultimatums for the next generation of geopolitical conflicts. The administration has effectively painted itself into a strategic corner with a highly publicized 10-day ticking clock. With no declared objective achieved, the escalation trap is fully engaged and counting down to zero. The situation currently unfolding represents a dangerous and fundamental paradox at the heart of American military strategy. The United States possesses the absolute kinetic capability to obliterate Iran's energy infrastructure within mere hours. However, it completely lacks the economic shield required to protect the world from the resulting financial devastation. The 10-day pause is a stark, unavoidable admission of the foundational reality of the globalized commodity market. Destroying a nation strategically located on the world's most critical energy choke point guarantees a systemic global shock. Iran's strategy of absorbing damage while threatening energy supplies exploits this exact American vulnerability perfectly. The transition from targeted precision strikes to a public 10-day countdown marks a terrifying new geopolitical chapter. The strategic landscape in the Middle East is currently balanced on the absolute edge of a historic rupture. The White House has drawn a definitive timeline, but whether Tehran will capitulate remains entirely unknown today. The effectiveness of this 10-day ultimatum has yet to be tested against a fully entrenched, desperate adversary. For now, the situation remains highly fluid, and the potential for a sudden, catastrophic regional escalation is imminent. Uncertainties remain regarding the true breaking point of both the Iranian regime and the fragile global economy. To truly understand the cascading consequences of these strategic decisions, ensure you remain engaged with our network. We analyze the critical intersection of military force and global economics to bring you the unvarnished reality. Thank you for your time and for seeking a deeper, more analytical perspective on today's defining international crisis.